Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. Adapted from the original file. They called Fort Jackson a place where people came to be broken and built back up. In the early light the barracks looked ordinary, row after row of beds and boots, but for Avery Collins that morning it felt like the hinge of everything she didn't know yet. She stepped off the bus with a duffel that had been with her through a dozen small lives, the hardware store, the nights at home after her mother got sick, the decision that had pulled her away from a town that kept shrinking around her. She kept her shoulders low, boots clicking on concrete, eyes combing faces until she found an empty spot in formation. The sergeant's voice cut through the field like a saw and she found herself obeying without thinking, the way people do when the past is heavy and they want new rules. Nora was already there, a bright thread in the gray, talkative, quick to offer gum or a grin, the kind of person who filled a room without meaning to. Marcus laughed too loudly at the wrong parts, trading stories with the others to chase off the nerves. Eli handled his kit with a steady focus that made him easier to trust than his smooth jokes let on. They clustered into the shape of a platoon, a patchwork of quiet and bravado, of stubborn teenage stubbornness and the older grit some carried like armor. Avery kept a small notebook in her pocket, a thing that made others roll their eyes until she showed them how she wrote down cadence, position, nuance, details the instructors gave once and everyone assumed would stick. Sergeant Harlan cut through the small talk. He had a voice of gravel and a habit of watching people the way weather watches a field. To him, emotion was a liability and discipline an investment. He barked orders and handed out corrections like the base handed out sugar packets, without ceremony and without apology. When he singled her out and used the name, Collins, with its thin edge, it landed differently than it had on others. She answered and straightened because there was nothing else to do. The heat pressed down and the first week washed over them in a haze of runs, obstacle courses, and cold, practical humiliations that taught you where your edges were. Emily, no, Avery, learned fast the one thing that would change everything, attention. While others joked and stumbled, she watched the way a rifle balanced in a hand, the tiny give of a trigger before a breath, the way an instructor's jaw tightened right before he corrected someone. Her grandfather's words lived in muscle memory, steady breath, respect the tool, and she started practicing alone when lights went out, cleaning the metal until the shine made her feel like she'd earned something. It was not about being noticed, it was about proving to herself that she could be more than the small, scared version of her life back home. By the time the range was set up, murmurs started. Somebody had seen how she moved through a drill, how her shots grouped tighter than the others. It was the kind of talk that can make people a target or a resource. Avery kept to herself, but the way Sergeant Harlan watched her changed, scrutiny shifted toward a careful, measuring respect. The camp had its jokes, its nicknames, its rituals, and if she was becoming a story, it was a slow one, earned in small acts, in steady breath, in the silent nights she spent practicing under a single bulb until the world quieted and she could hear only the rhythm she wanted to keep. Morning after morning, Avery woke before the others, laced her boots in the dark, and went to the range with a small tin of oil and a clean cloth. The world there reduced to metal and breath, everything that didn't matter dropped away. It was during qualification week that the quiet work finally met a moment that refused to stay small. The line snapped into place at dawn, target set, wind measured by graduates with cigarette butts between their fingers. Harlan walked the line like he was counting sins, clipboard in hand, and the other recruits shifted, jokes dying in their mouths when the sergeant's eyes passed over them. Avery felt the tension the way a muscle feels cold before it stretches, necessary, sharp, alive. She lay prone when it was her turn, the stock snug against her shoulder the way it had always been, the same small ritual she'd practiced until her fingers remembered it alone. Nora sat a few positions down, jaw clenched in that protective way she had, and Eli watched their form as if it were a problem he could solve with a softer voice. Marcus tried to make the others laugh, but even his voice was small next to the percussion of rounds. Avery's focus narrowed to the reticle, to the tiny tremor in her own hand she had learned to ride instead of fight. She breathed in, settled, and let her finger finish what the rest of her had begun. The first shot cracked and landed dead center. The second did the same. The third, fourth, each hit pulled a thread through the air that tightened around the group until the joke stopped and only the metallic scrape of brass remained. Harlan's mouth was a line. He wrote on his clipboard, but his pen didn't move fast enough to catch what the targets already had written. When she finished, the instructor with the binoculars muttered under his breath and a few of the recruits stared like they'd seen a ghost or a miracle. "Beginner's luck," someone said, and then swallowed the words when the board said otherwise. Word traveled in training camp the way smoke travels, slow and precise. By that afternoon, a whisper had reached the mess hall: "Collins, 10 for 10. People who'd ignored her all week found reasons to sit near her table. Some came with questions, others with thin praise that sounded like bar tabs, a necessary civility. Sergeant Harlan stopped by while she washed down a tray and offered the kind of remark he rarely wasted: "Keep that up and you might teach these clowns how to breathe." It wasn't a compliment dressed up, it was a notice. Avery nodded and felt something like permission settle over her shoulders. That night, instead of sleeping, she cleaned the bolt until it gleamed, then wrote numbers in the little notebook she kept tucked under her mattress: range, wind, minute adjustments, data, not dreams. Lyle, the weapons instructor, looked through her notebook once and frowned at the precision. "You're not doing this for attention, Collins," he said. "Good. Don't start." He didn't have to explain why. Attention in this place could be leverage or a target. Within a week, her file had been passed up the chain. A note scribbled in red suggested she be considered for the marksman track. The suggestion felt like a small hinge swinging open. When Harlan called her to the briefing tent that afternoon, the walk felt longer than the 100 steps she'd taken since she'd arrived. The sergeant studied her in a way that said he'd found the proof he'd been waiting for. "You got steady hands and a mind for calculation," he said. "You don't blow apart under noise. That's what matters." It sounded like a diagnosis and an order. Packing for the transfer, Avery understood that anything familiar could be left behind now, but she also knew the quiet rhythm would go with her. On the convoy to Fort Moore, she watched the Georgia pines blur past and thought of the small house she'd left. The training ground had already given her more than marks to the board. It had taught her to keep calm when everything else demanded noise. What she didn't know yet was how far the calm would have to stretch, and what it would take before the world finally learned to call her by something besides quiet. The transfer to Fort Moore felt like stepping into a different kind of concentration. The ranges were longer, the targets smaller, and the instructors less forgiving. Lyle's voice carried here like a metronome. Every correction had rhythm and consequence. Avery slid into the marksman program the way someone slips into water that's colder than they expected, awkward at first, then necessary. The routines multiplied: wind formulas, ballistics tables, time on target drills that read like math problems meant to be solved with a steady heartbeat. The other students were older, their faces weathered by deployments and nights that left a permanent crease under one eye. They watched her with a mix of curiosity and a quiet challenge, as if measuring whether she would be a story that lasted or a flash that burned out. Jonah became her spotter, not by paperwork but because he showed up first when the range opened and left last when it closed. He was practical in the way someone who's seen too much has to be: short, direct, efficient with eyes that looked for patterns in movement. They worked in silence more than they talked. He would call wind, she would calculate, and together they would make shots that read like agreements. Captain Wade noticed the pairing and began assigning them to the tougher drills, the ones where mistakes had consequences beyond a lowered score. Avery didn't let the responsibility thrill her, it tightened the line she walked. She understood that every successful calculation meant someone else might live. That kept her precise and it kept her awake at night. Challenges came in forms she hadn't expected. There were drills that tested patience, hours waiting for the right light, the right wind, the right breath, and there were drills that tested choices. In a simulated Overwatch exercise, they were asked to engage targets that moved among simulated civilians. The ethical weight of pulling a trigger in that context sat like a stone in her gut. She practiced the mechanics perfectly, but afterward she couldn't shake the feeling that numbers and technique only took you so far. There were decisions that no manual could make for you, and those were the ones that carved lines into a person. Word of her scores spread beyond Fort Moore. An officer asked to see her file. Invitations to assist in advanced exercises arrived. Some of it felt good, validation for the work, but part of her bristled at the idea that accuracy alone would define what she was worth. She wanted to teach control, not just be an exhibit of it. Still, the attention brought more responsibility, and responsibility brought friction. One senior marksman, older and blunt, challenged her methods openly in front of a group. He said training wasn't about notebooks and quiet practice, it was about instincts honed in chaos. The room went quiet. Avery didn't argue. She set up her rifle, called Jonah over, and shot. The group watched the target better than any lecture. Outside the range, life pressed in. Marcus sent letters that were mostly jokes and small attempts at keeping a thread to the world she'd left. Nora married someone from her platoon and sent pictures with smiling faces that hurt and warmed at the same time. Eli went on to a different specialty and would drop by when he could. The community had splintered and reformed, and Avery found comfort in the routines that meant she could rely on a known sequence when everything else felt uncertain. Then came the deployment orders. The email arrived in the middle of a night shift, a small page of text that rearranged the future. FOB Falcon Ridge, Kandahar. Immediate preparation. The word deploy hangs differently in a person's mouth once you hear it as a plan and not a possibility. Pack lists blurred into practicalities, ammo, optics, med kits, but the real work was mental, preparing to keep a pulse steady when other people were looking at you as the difference between coming home and not. Captain Wade called her in and said, "You know why they picked you." He didn't say it like praise. He said it like a fact. The pause afterward felt like everything tightening toward a single point. On the flight to deployment, Avery watched the map beneath them, the land shrinking into shapes she'd only ever read about. She thought about the people she'd saved in exercises, about the people she'd failed to save in simulations. She thought about Jonah's steady hand and Marcus's stories, about Harlan's gravel voice and her grandfather's patient lessons. She felt ready in the way somebody can be prepared for a test but still surprised by the size of the classroom. The calm she had trained into herself felt pliant now, like a tool she could shape, but the world she was going into would ask her to use it in ways that might break or build something inside her that could not be undone. That calm would be tested in a way she had never fully imagined, and it happened the morning the convoy hit the ridge. The sun was sharp and white, painting the rocks in a hard clarity that made shadows like scars across the ground. Engines rolled, radios clicked, and for a few minutes everything sounded like routine, until the first blast turned routine into chaos. The lead truck exploded into flame, a shockwave that seemed to lift the air itself. Men shouted, ATVs flipped, and dust swallowed the convoy. For a breath, everything narrowed to the sound of metal and people falling. Avery hit the deck before she thought, training folding her into muscle memory. Jonah was beside her in a move that had grown from habit. He murmured numbers into the radio, and she heard them as if through cotton. High ground, mile line, multiple shooters, he said. Her hands moved. The world through her scope was a war of heat and mirage, a place where edges melted and intention had to be sharper than fear. She found the line of the ridge and began the long braiding of math and breath, distance, elevation, wind, humidity. Every variable was a small argument the bullet would have to win. The enemy had the high ground and the confidence of someone who thought his line of sight was final. The first rounds that came down were precise, surgical, designed to break things that had names. Marcus hit the dirt, cursing. Dean's hand bled where shrapnel had found him. Captain Wade barked orders that turned men into movement: suppress, extract, cover. Someone screamed for medevac. The radio filled with fractured sounds, and for a second the world felt like a set of snapshots thrown against a wall. Jonah called wind shifts and target movement like a metronome, steady and exact. He counted off degrees and ticks on the scope, and Avery adjusted, slow and sure. Her training was a ledger she had learned to read in the dark. She could feel the weight of the whole convoy on each tiny correction she made. If she misjudged, a person with a name would fall. If she was right, they would live and the story of the day would be different. She saw the glint finally, a flash between two rocks, a rifle like a promise. It was far, longer than any shot they'd practiced, farther than Jonah had ever taken in training, but there it was, a small, deliberate space in the heat. Avery's breath tightened and she matched it to a rhythm: inhale, hold, exhale, half, settle. The world narrowed to the reticle and the tiny movement at the edge. She pulled the trigger. The shot cracked like a bell and then the ragged sound of battle continued, but something had shifted. The shooter slumped, and for a second the firing pattern stuttered as if someone had hit pause on the world. It wasn't over. There were others, and an IED would still claim a life if it had been set. But the sniper's fall bought time, seconds that stretched into minutes, and those minutes allowed medics to move, allowed the convoy to reorganize and pull some of the wounded to safer ground. Captain Wade's voice came through the static, low and steady. "Carter, status?" Jonah answered first, voice rough with relief. "Target neutralized. Multiple enemy positions suppressed. We can extract." The words were practical and small, but they held an enormous thing: survival. Afterwards, when the dust settled and men counted who was shaken and who was gone, the ridge looked like a bad memory you had to step over. The commander walked up, boots making soft sounds in sand turned to ash, and his brief nod said more than any ceremony. There were hands on shoulders, rough and grateful, and a quiet that had nothing to do with peace. Avery felt the weight of what she'd done slide across her like a current. Praise came later in briefings and in the form of orders that reclassified her file, notes that said commendation and possible advancement. Photos would be taken, reports filed, and somewhere a name would be written down and retold. But in the small hush at the edge of the field, Jonah sat beside her and neither spoke for a long time. The adrenaline unspooled slowly, and what remained was the immediate, inconvenient presence of what the shot had required. A life had ended because of her hand. A dozen lives had continued because of that same hand. The two facts did not fit neatly together, and they did not feel like a medal. They felt like the truth, precise, simple, and heavy. That night there was a quiet that was not the easy kind. Men drank or prayed or slept with one eye open. Avery lay on a cot and looked at the ceiling, thinking of small things: her grandfather's voice, Jonah's steady counting, the smell of brass, and she felt an odd thing: the calm she had trained for was both a tool and a cost. Her shot had changed everything, and the world had no simple gratitude to offer for the balancing act she'd performed. The battalion had survived. That was a fact. How she fit inside that fact was the work she would live with, and it was only just beginning. After the ridge, the days moved with a strange mix of routine and ceremony. Medics checked wounds, mechanics fixed Humvees, and the after-action reports folded the chaos into neat paragraphs. The battalion patched itself back together the way you stitch a sleeve, rough at first, then tighter as hands grew steadier. Command sent a small, efficient congratulations through the chain. Captain Wade slapped her on the back with a grip that meant more than words, and the men who'd been closest to the blast kept looking at her the way you look at someone who saved you and also changed something you can't name. The paperwork arrived in a stack: commendations, a possible reassignment, notes from intelligence and a request: their story should be shared up the line. Someone took pictures, someone else wrote the first draft of the press blurb. The battalion's survival had a practical currency and someone wanted to make sure it circulated. Avery signed forms with a lightness that felt almost foreign. Praise was oddly efficient, like a tool issued and then returned when the work was done. Back at base there were small rituals. Men bought one another coffee, a care package arrived from a family back home with cookies that tasted like normal, and Jonah sat with her more than he had before, counting off angles and asking about the small details as if cataloging the night for himself. He asked how she felt when she pulled the trigger and she told him the mechanics, like a technician explaining why a machine worked. He nodded and didn't ask about the weight. That was an unspoken rule. The practical questions got answered, the rest collected dust. Word spread beyond the wire. The division sent a note up the chain, and before long there were invitations, interviews, a formal ceremony, even a mention in internal briefings. Public Affairs asked for a short statement. The lopped-off version of a life paired her to a clean quote and a photo with a ribbon. She agreed to the ceremony because refusing felt performative and because the men who had been under fire deserved recognition. At the ceremony, Captain Wade read the basic facts, the folding of events into phrases that somehow made everything smaller. They pinned a medal on her chest, a small, shiny thing that caught light and didn't catch the meaning. Men shook her hand. Cameras clicked. The room smelled like institutional polish and coffee. Back in the quiet space of her bunk, the medal sat on the shelf like an unfamiliar artifact. The letters from strangers were harder to read, parents thanking her for bringing sons home, recruits saying she inspired them. Those were honest, but they were also noisy in a way her practiced calm couldn't mute. She slept and woke to the same small rituals, cleaning her rifle, counting breath, but now there was a strain of watchfulness. People expected something from her beyond skill. They wanted a symbol. Dr. Meredith requested a short session and their talk shifted the shape of the days. She didn't offer platitudes. She asked about the small, private things, what came to mind before sleep, what images woke her, whether the hand that fired trembled afterward. Avery answered with practical detail, then let silence do some of the work. The counselor suggested a different kind of training, one about staying present, about holding a life that now included a shot that ended another. It wasn't neat, it was work, like any other drill. A letter arrived with a familiar stamp, Captain Wade's handwriting folded across official letterhead. The Army wanted her to consider a marksman instructor position back stateside at Fort Jackson, an offer rooted not in publicity but in making her method part of the training. Teaching would be close to the thing that had steadied her, turning a practiced rhythm into something others could learn. The idea felt both like relief and like a grave responsibility. She could stay in the heat and do the work that kept her team alive, or she could try to spread the steadiness to others, to make the cost she'd paid useful beyond a single moment on the ridge. She walked the perimeter at dusk, the desert sun lowering like a coin into shadow, and thought of the people she'd saved and of the one she'd stopped. The two facts remained side by side, each heavier because of the other. Jonah joined her without announcing himself, handed her a bottle of water, and said nothing for a long time. "You did right," he said finally, not a sermon but a fact. Avery took the water and let the relief travel through her in slow degrees. The resolution wasn't immediate. The world had not granted absolution nor had it demanded damnation. It offered a path, teach, live, and keep bearing the weight with as much honesty as she could. She tucked the captain's letter into her pocket and felt, for the first time since the ridge, something like a direction that might hold. The flight back felt quieter than she expected. The landscape under the wings slid by in a way that made the world seem rearrangeable, like maps you could fold differently if you knew how. Fort Jackson smelled the same, pine and gun oil and the low hum of a place built on routine, but walking into the training compound as an instructor was different from walking in as a recruit. People looked at her in a new way, not just the kid who shot straight, but someone assigned to teach the next person who might have to make that same impossible choice. That weight arrived with her, but it did not feel like a trap. It felt like work. Her first class was a mixture of faces she recognized and faces that were raw with question. They had watched a video clip in a media roundup, or they had heard the rumor on the line. When she stepped to the firing line and told them to close their eyes before the first shot, there was a small, skeptical rustle. She kept her voice steady and simple. Close your eyes. Breathe. Think about one thing you protect, and hold it there. One breath. One shot at a time. It was not a speech. It was a rule. She watched them practice the rhythm she had learned as a way to not lose herself between breaths. The first few tries were sloppy, hands shook, shoulders hunched. She corrected posture, not with reprimand but with precise, quiet direction. Adjust your trigger finger like this, relax the jaw, let the exhale be part of the pull. Little by little, the shots tightened. The room changed from noise into a rhythm of controlled practice, and she felt, in those small moments, that teaching could be a kind of healing for both student and teacher. Public Affairs asked to film a session. She said yes with conditions: no flashy interviews, no glorified angle. Let them show discipline and steadiness, she told the officer, not the dramatics. The footage ran on a training channel, posted by recruits who wanted the technique. Letters came from families: "Thank you for teaching my kid how to keep steady," and a few came from veterans groups asking if she would lead a community program on mental resilience. She agreed to the community work because it felt honest. It was about methods to manage what lived in the dark hours, not about medals. Jonah visited when he could. He remained that steady point in her life who counted wins and kept calculations tidy. They ran drills together, watched recruits take their first long shots, and sometimes they didn't say much at all. He read the quiet in her and didn't try to fix it. That acceptance mattered more than applause. Dr. Meredith checked in regularly, helping staff build short debrief exercises after live fire to let recruits talk about what they felt, tiny things meant to prevent the build-up she had known too well. The program grew and the training manual acquired a new section: breathing and mental reset alongside zeroing and wind calls. It was small institutional change, but it was change the same. The Pentagon invitation came, as it had been hinted, an advisory role, a short stint to help roll the method across training centers. She accepted with one condition: she would not be used for PR without permission to speak honestly. They agreed. In Washington, she sat at a long table with officers who used big words for small things, and she explained, plainly, how breathing and simple rituals made a marksman steadier and a soldier less likely to carry a burden that broke them later. The room listened, not because she demanded it but because she had something they could manufacture: experience that was precise and painful in equal measure. Back at Fort Jackson, the seasons changed. She taught, she corrected, she watched recruits grow into the same steady shapes she had once craved. Sometimes she would find a note pinned to her locker: "Thanks for teaching me how to breathe." Those 3 words mattered more than any citation. She still cleaned her rifle at night, the ritual unchanged, but the feeling around it had shifted. It was not only maintenance for a tool, it was practice, a loop that kept her connected to a purpose she had chosen. One afternoon, after a long week of classes, she walked out to the range alone, set a target at a modest distance, and lay down. There was no mission, no convoy, no one depending on that single bullet. She breathed in, held, and let it out, the way she taught. The shot cracked and hit the target squarely. She sat up and looked at the hole and felt something like permission to keep living. The cost of the ridge did not evaporate, and there were days when the memory sharpened like glass. But she had learned how to organize that weight, how to hand off what she knew so it didn't calcify into an unspoken thing inside others. Years later, soldiers would tell recruits about the instructor who taught not just aim but steadiness under pressure. They would tell them about a woman who kept her voice low and her lessons exact, and who, over time, made sure that a rifle was a tool and not a story that consumed the hand that pulled the trigger. Avery sometimes heard her name in halls and she would nod, not comfortable with fuss, but grateful that something she had trained into existence lived on. Standing at the edge of the firing line one evening, watching young trainees take their turns, she realized the shot that had changed everything had also given her a path. It did not erase the silence in her nights, but it gave her a way to walk through it, and that was, in the end, enough.